Welcome back, Chappelle. All right, so first of all, shout out to Riley Valley for hitting a brother up with a new football. All right, and then also we're gonna go ahead and pick up exactly where we left off in class. So this doesn't take too long. Now we started talking about how, like for example, in class we started talking about Ivan the Fourth, Ivan the Terrible, right? Rurikid is his last name, Rurikid, and we started talking about how he is going to be the first Tsar, Caesar, of Russia, right? He's going to start consolidating power, and he's going to start trying to pull Russia into its own kingdom, and he kind of groups them all together, and of course he looks like this. He centralizes his government away from other entities like, for example, the Mongols, who were actually still present at the time in certain areas. These other people called the Cossacks. But Ivan is going to keep on rolling forward, and he's going to start stripping power from the boyars as well. Now, the Russian boyars, that's the name of their nobility. All right, so Russian boyars are just like lords in England, or robe and sword nobles in France, or in the Holy Roman Empire, they were actually called Junkers, spelled Junkers, right? So, biggest thing about Ivan is he starts stripping a lot of power from these boyars. So there's a lot of historians that believe that Ivan probably wasn't that terrible. Like, he was actually probably a very, very good governing person. He had like 7 different wives, actually, which is crazy. His first wife, they say, is his true absolute love. We know he was prone to, like, according to story, he was prone to a possible bipolar disorder, very wild mood swings and things like that. But he efficiently created an absolute government by stripping power away from these boyars, and chances are that the boyars are actually the ones who called him the Terrible, because nobody likes losing power, right? So he creates an absolutist state, though, and he's going to do this very, very well, but unfortunately, his dynasty is going to die out in 1613, and the Romanov family is going to take over. Now, put this in there really quick. The Romanov family rules over Russia until 1917, the very first one being Mikhail Romanov, right? Following this period known as the Time of Troubles, right? So here's a crazy thing that happens. We started talking about this in class a little bit, about Ivan the Terrible, Ivan Rurikid himself, right? So being the first Tsar of Russia, right, behind his father, Ivan III, who did major work pushing the Mongols out of Moscow, Ivan is going to be left having several kids. He had like somewhere upwards of like 8 kids, but he outlived all of them except one, all right? So the big kids that he had, more than anybody else you need to know, is Ivan, his son, Ivan Ivanovich, right? Ivan, who would be Ivan V, and then Fedor. Poor, pitiful little Fedor. All right, so like Fedor was known as a very pious person, which is fine. Totally awesome. He would apparently barely knew how to read. He would apparently spend hours upon hours upon hours in his room all the time, quietly contemplating deep thought, apparently. And there is some conjecture that he did not hold the temperament of being a king and was simple-minded, is what some scholars say. And so, poor Fedor. But it was okay. The Rurikid dynasty was really fine with it because everybody was like, you know, Fedor is just going to be Fedor for his whole life because we got Ivan Ivanovich, we got Ivan Jr. ready to take the throne, right? Well, what ends up happening, apparently, is Ivan Ivanovich, right, so Ivan Jr., Ivan the Terrible's son, came to supper one evening with his wife. And his wife was apparently dressed immodestly. But the thing about it was many historians believe that she wasn't dressed immodestly. They believe that she might have been pregnant and that maybe she just looked as though she was kind of like swelling in certain parts of her bodies, that Ivan the Terrible interpreted this as, you're not dressed appropriately. So according to story and legend, Ivan the Terrible right here beat Ivan V's wife up until the point of a miscarriage, right? Ivan V, soon to be Ivan V, Ivan Jr., is actually going to go confront him about this. He yells at him, he yells at him, he yells at him. He's like, how dare you do this? You know, like she was carrying my child probably. He then looks down. Ivan the Terrible was holding a scepter with a pointed end on it, flips it around, stabs his son in the side of the head in the temple, right? Son collapses to the ground dead. Ivan then begins to sob. He starts crying, grabs his son, holds him tight. This is another evidence that we believe might have actually been emblematic of his bipolar disorder. But Then, who's left to rule? Oh, poor Fedor, right? So poor sits in a quiet room for hours on end, Fedor, right? So Fedor becomes Fedor the First of Russia. Now, unfortunately, Fedor never has any children, right? And he also loses several wars to very, very important factions like Polish-Lithuania, which no one loses to Polish-Lithuania during this time except for Russia. But in 1613, following the time of troubles, the Romanov family is going to come into power, right? And this guy is the most famous of the Romanovs, right? So this Romanov himself is known as Peter the Great. Now, really, really quickly, looking back at Ivan the Terrible, look at Ivan the Terrible, who looks very stereotypical Russian, right? Wearing a large robe, a symbol of wealth. Actually, the boyars also wore these big robes, carrying a scepter of power, wearing a cold weather hat, and having a very, very large beard, which was very, very emblematic of Russian lifestyle, manners, and also decorum. He is Russian. Does Peter look Russian? Peter does not look Russian. Peter looks more French. He looks more Western European, right? A lot of this is because Peter was known as Peter the Great, and he is going to take it upon himself to modernize all of Russia, right? So he does this thing where he takes a journey to the West. What you need to put next to it right here is he called it his Grand Tour, or his Grand Tour of the West, right? So Peter left Russia for a time and went on a quest, and he wore a disguise so nobody would know who he is, even though, ironically enough, he's pretty easy to spot because he's 6'8". It's huge, all right? So 6'8", Peter the Great, dresses in disguise, and then goes and begins to travel around all of Western Europe, seeing the things that they have to offer. He goes to the Netherlands to try and see how to build ships. He goes to England to try and learn intercoastal economics, colonization, and also military prowess. He then wanted to go to France so he could learn diplomacy and government and politics, but he brings all these ideas that he had back, right? He lost several, or he's going to try and, he actually has to leave his grand tour early. He has to go have a war with Finland at the time to a very young 15-year-old Charles, who was actually in charge of Finland. He ends up losing, which is pretty catastrophic. But following that, he even develops the Russian Navy, which Russia never had a navy up to this point because they were a landlocked country. But they start creating port cities and starting to take over areas that the Ottomans owned that became a very large rival. But he's the one who's responsible for making Russia an important European state because he modernized them, right? He brought in sweeping military changes. He created a professional standing army of 210,000. He adopted the Julian calendar, the calendar that all of Western Europe was using. The Russians thought it was like the year 7,000 and something. They then actually switched to the way that Europeans dated everything following Peter the Great. He also brought in sweeping cultural changes. He was like, if you want to talk to me, you must speak to me in French if it is about matters of state, because that is the language of diplomats, right? He wrote a book on Russian manners, on how to be couth and proper. He made men shave their beards outside of Moscow. You could get a ticket if you tried to enter Moscow with a beard on your face, right? He had actually men with razors stationed at the city gates ready to shave your beard off, right? He also made, women apparently could only travel through Moscow with a veiled face. This is actually an old holdout from the Mongolian era, right? So he brought women more rights, and he made it so they could walk around in public without being veiled and oftentimes unescorted, right? So he's doing a lot of things, and he's creating the European version of Russia that you know today, right? You think of Russia as being European now, right? You don't think of Ivan the Terrible's Russia, which is much more Asiatic in culture, right? If you looked at St. Basil's Cathedral was built by Ivan the Terrible, right? Let's go ahead and look at it real quick. Ivan the Terrible. Wait, crap. So we'll go St. Basil's Cathedral. So if we look at St. Basil's Cathedral real quick, St. Basil's Cathedral in Russia, here we go, looks like this, right? Which has many, 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 many traits of Eastern-style architecture, right? The colorful domes, the large steeples. It's got elements, little tiny bit of elements of Gothic, but it looks much more Eastern than it does anything else, right? That's St. Basil's Cathedral. Well, Peter is going to develop his own city, a new one, and he's going to call it St. Petersburg, right? St. Petersburg was the window into the West. St. Petersburg was the port city that he established for the Russian Navy to come in and out of and dock and use as a port town itself. And it actually became the new Russian capital up until 1918. Not surprisingly enough, named after himself. He did not name St. Petersburg after himself. He named it after St. Peter himself, the, of course, first pope, right? Even though he was Eastern Orthodox his entire life. Port city, though, brought new goods and ideas to Russia and is going to welcome in cultural diffusion and bring Russia into a modern light within the European state and create the European version of Russia that you know today. This is one of the port cities in St. Petersburg, which looks a lot like, it reminds me a lot of the city of Amsterdam with the small canals and the waterways and things like that. And it's even laid out exactly like a European city would be in the West. And this is the glorious Winter Palace that he had built for the Romanov family, right? It's built in the emblematic style of the Palace of Versailles, even though the Palace of Versailles was built in what was known as Baroque architecture. This is Rococo, and Rococo means it's like uneven. It means like an irregular pearl, right? So but this is the palace that he had built for the Russians, right? He's bringing Russia into the modern light. He's creating the European Russia that you know now, all right? So I'll talk to you guys later, though. That's the rest for this unit. You know Ivan the Terrible. We'll talk just a little bit about his story tomorrow, and I'll see you guys then. We're going to review tomorrow. Test for A period is on Thursday. Test for everybody else is on Friday. I'll see you guys then. Have a good one.